Hello, I'm Victor, and this is The Junkyard. I am getting annoyed. See, I wanted to review 1962's Day of the Triffids, a film I remember disliking. So I order it in from Netflix. What I get is instead a 1981 BBC television version that I didn't even know existed. So, having been once thwarted, I go to the library system and try to track down Day of the Triffids, even checking to make sure that it was a 1962 version. I still got the 1981 version. So, having gone through a great deal of effort to get a movie I didn't even like, I gave up and just decided to review 1981's Day of the Triffids, a 80s television remake of a film I don't like. This is gonna be fun.
Well, to be fair, this 6-part television miniseries was an adaptation of a book by John Wyndham, rather than the 1962 movie. The original film didn't impress me. Let's see how this does. Part 1 starts with Bill laying in a hospital bed with his eyes bandaged. He's just woken up and is recording his experiences for a friend of his who is writing a book. This is a rather clever and atmospheric way to lead into backstory, but before we go into that, Hero observes from the lack of noise that it must be very early morning. As he explains that someone will be in with his tea hours later at 7 a.m., the camera pans over his clock, reading nearly 8 a.m. Again, clever and atmospheric. Anyway, the backstory tells us the history of the Triffids. Large plants. Possibly bred or engineered by humans, they were first seen in the tropics and were capable of independent locomotion. Walking plants. As a child, Bill was the first person to see their true nature when one, somehow knowing to aim for his face, whips him with a stinger, nearly blinding him. Deadly, potentially clever plants. People try to eradicate the spreading menace and almost succeed when someone discovers that the Triffids produce an oil that severely increases fuel efficiency when added to petroleum. Lucrative plants. Bill ends up working at a Triffid farm where another accident has landed him in a city hospital. Widely dispersed, conveniently located plants.
I like the idea that rather than humans being unable to stop the Triffids, they simply came up with a reason not to. These days, I think keeping a deadly plant species alive because it produces an oil that can increase fuel efficiency would be a reasonable trade-off, but I think back in the 80s this was a clear-cut example of self-destructive human greed.
In any case, one more flashback brings us to the present. The previous night, most of the world was watching the skies where a dazzling comet bombardment was filling the sky with gorgeous lights, something that Bill was quietly upset to be missing. Bill eventually realizes that something is wrong and gingerly takes off his own bandages, finally able to see again. Part 1 ends when, encountering his own blinded eye doctor, he realizes that everyone is either blind or dead. Back at the farm, the Triffid pens are empty. Part 2 sees Bill wandering out into the Silent City. That's actually something worth noting. A worldwide calamity has left many dead, but perhaps just as many alive, yet unable to see, and the city is silent. In America, that is the makings of a particularly noisy post-apocalypse. But this is England, home of the steady on and the stiff upper lip, so they decided to suffer in dignified silence. All that screaming and running around simply isn't done.
Yeah, I apologize for the accent, but I can't promise I'm not going to do it again.
Anyway, back to the movie. Bill encounters a family with one seeing child, where he discovers that the previous night's lights were the reason for the blindness. As he and the girl's father talk, Bill begins to see how much worse things will get and how little he can do to help. Later, he encounters Josella, aka Jo, another unblind, who, although pretty, does kind of look like a woman trying to meet Eddie Izzard coming from the other direction, if that makes any sense. Anyway, Bill and Jo team up and soon encounter a roving Triffid. Bill kills it, showing that the plant things are not especially powerful beyond their poison stingers, but the fallen Triffid taps out a signal that soon draws others near, and our protagonists beat a hasty retreat.
You know, the Triffids are a strange kind of monster. They're dangerous plants, but they're not that hard to deal with in normal circumstances. It took the whole world just going blind to make them a legitimate threat. I think that they're actually more scary for that, though. If you put a more overwhelming monster like the alien xenomorph in the same situation, it wouldn't work. He's a threat no matter what. But in this case, they're just one link higher on the food chain than humans, and that makes it all the more effective.
Back with Bill and Jo, now in part 3, they're forced to abandon their car when it gets mobbed. The mob is obviously dangerous, but they're also undeniably in need. Not so much for any one commodity, but for help, more than two people can really provide. While most movies try to make you mentally dehumanize the mob, this one goes out of its way to prevent that. Well, that night, after finding another car and holding up in a suite, Bill spots a signal light in a distant building. The next day they investigate and find a group of unblind, protected by the remnants of the government, preparing to abandon the city and its blinded inhabitants. Bill and Joe join them, reluctantly agreeing with the logic of it. Bill, meanwhile, warns the de facto leader of the group of the potential spread of the Triffids, but gets the brush off.
The scientisty hero warns the pompous authority figure of a potential threat and is subsequently ignored. It's the oldest cliché in disaster movie history. However, in this case, they did establish that while the Triffids had the potential to be a menace, they were put under control in time. Stop a problem, get a star. Prevent a problem, no one cares because there was never a problem. It's a thing that happens all the time in real life, and I think that's what they were going for here, so while it is a cliché, this time it works.
Here we do get down to some Dr. Strangelove-style future planning, as at a group meeting they discuss how the new world will have to work. Repopulation and all that, you know the drill. Also attending, Saddam Hussein and Dean Stockwell's love child. Anyway, Bill and Joe talk about the 3 wives to a husband concept, which leads to some flirting that makes me uncomfortable in a few distinct ways, and the two finally kiss. That night, someone sets fire to the group's building, and as Bill runs down to help, he's knocked unconscious. He comes to in part 4, where he has been kidnapped by Jack, who wants to stay and help the city's blind in the hope that someone will come to offer aid. An incredibly long shot. Having not gotten support from Bill's group, he and the others kidnapped some of them and are forcing each to act as seeing eye humans for entire sections of the city. They are, in fact, being forced into leadership in handcuffs and manacles.
I've always figured that anyone who would seek out an authority role shouldn't actually be trusted with authority, but I don't think the opposite works all that much better.
Anyway, a kindly jailer informs Bill that Joe is safe but in the same situation, and that thought keeps him sane while he adapts to his new role as the eyes of his community. Soon enough, however, the group is menaced by a human gang, Triffids, and disease, the first of which relieves Bill of his jailers, the last of which either kills off or drives away the rest of his community, whereupon he leaves to go find Joe. The same seems to have happened with her group, leading Bill back to the Unblind's abandoned hideout. In Part 5, Bill meets up with Jack, the very man who had him kidnapped. He had the same experience, so the two head off together to join the survivors. Unfortunately, when they get to the Unblind's new address, they find that the group is schismed. When Bill asks about Joe, the group's leader explains the history of the split in what, for Bill, would have been unwelcomed detail. This might have seemed like an unnatural way to give backstory if Bill didn't look as impatient as I did. Anyway, the long and short of it is that half of the original group was intent on survival at the expense of Christian sexual morality and moved on to a new location, and the other group is putting their survival in God's hands and staying put.
It wouldn't have been a complete cross-section of post-apocalyptic humanity if they didn't have the religious nuts. But to be fair, the movie was actually pretty conservative with them. They decided to give the Church of Post-England a little bit of dignity rather than frothing insanity.
Anyway, after Jack tries in vain to get the churches to rely a bit more on their intelligence and God's mercy, he and Bill continue on to the other group. Along the way, they encounter more Triffids, and Jack chooses to return to the churches under the logic that perhaps their more primitive approach actually offers a better chance for long-term survival. Bill, however, decides to go on looking for Joe, and... why is it only now that I notice that Bill has my exact hair color and style? Gosh darn it, I could have been calling him Skinny Me this entire time! Oh well, too late now. So on his way, Bill saves an unblind girl named Susan from a Triffid, and the two continue on towards Joe, who he realizes has probably gone to a location they had previously talked about in the south, and skips trying to find her with the other survival group. Once in the general location, Bill and Susan manage to find Joe. She's holed up with a blind and pregnant couple. Together they plan to go back to the churches, but when Bill heads back there to tell them they're coming, he sees that everyone is either dead of disease or Triffids. As Bill, Joe, and the others regroup and talk about making it on their own, Triffids are seen massing outside.
Yet another instance of wondering why the hell these type of things always need to focus on one tiny group of survivors. Guys, spread out!
Part 6 starts a few years later, Bill and Joe having spawned their own child alongside the blind couple. They've made a life for themselves and suffered no casualties, but the Triffids are now everywhere and keep surrounding the house as fast as the humans can destroy them. Soon they break through the fence. The humans manage to repel them, but it's obvious the situation is far from ideal. Bill and Joe talk, and he speculates that the Triffids, the blindness, and the disease were all of human manufacture. Soon they meet up again with Jack, who apparently survived. He's part of one of several successful survivor groups, and he's come to Bill for help. Help to finally wipe out the Triffids using his knowledge and experience. He agrees, though they decide to wait on joining them until the first day of autumn.
Oh, for gods, don't you guys understand how this works yet?
Yep. Soon they're beset by a militaristic group bent on survival and conquest. They want to make Bill and Joe wards of another group of blind as prisoners in their own overtaxed home, and take Susan away for reassignment. That evening, as Joe gets the soldiers drunk, Bill sabotages their vehicles, and the two families escape into the early morning gloom, feeling quite free to bust a hole in their fence, so the Triffids and the militarists can get to know each other. As Bill narrates his feelings of hope for the future, the movie ends.
So, dang, I really like this one.
Don't get me wrong, it's not perfect. It tends to jump from one moral/political issue/allegory without much fleshing out a resolution. It can make the story seem a bit cluttered and rushed, though to be fair, that can make it seem more organic and realistic as well. The, trinity of disaster, blindness, Triffids, and disease, also had their problems. For instance, the blindness might have been a bit too crippling. Of course there'd be confusion early on, but soon enough they'd be able to get organized with or without seers. The Triffids, as I said, were not very threatening on their own, nor were they a huge part of the story till the end. I don't mind, but this was supposed to be their day, you know? And lastly, the disease. There was an offhand reference to it possibly being a bit of biological warfare, but that's as far as they went with it. It seemed to serve only to kill off inconvenient characters in a convenient fashion. It's basically the Holy Ghost of the Disaster Trinity, difficult to define and arguably unnecessary. Nevertheless, the characters came across as very human, the atmosphere really pulled you in, and I genuinely didn't know what to expect from the beginning right to the end. It was an engaging story that makes the viewer ask a lot of questions.
All in all, I'm glad I decided to watch Day of the Triffids 1981. It was a pleasant surprise. Well, this has been Victor with The Junkyard. Thanks for watching and have a good day. You know, I think I had more bad things to say about a film that I actually liked than most of the films that I really hate.